Anomaly Wormwood-2 was supposed to be about fallout that behaved itself. That's the phrase the file keeps circling without using. Behaved itself. The charts, the procedures, the emergency plans, everything in that era depended on radioactive residue doing what it was told, at least statistically. You release energy in one place, it spreads along familiar patterns. It thins out, it settles. It might poison, maim, ruin land for decades, but it obeys certain rules. This file exists because, for a brief window in one forgotten corner of the Soviet map, the writing said something else. Fallout that did not act like fallout, and instruments that reacted as if they were being watched. I realized it was not an ordinary incident long before I finished the first page. The signal came from the same place they all come from in this archive. Pencil, tired handwriting. Inside the cover where only someone like me will see it. No stamp, no title. Just a line in English translation, cramped along the cardboard edge. Contamination does not stay where matter is. Recordings unstable. Do not trust distance. Whoever wrote that had already lost the argument with whatever they were measuring, and was trying, a little too late, to warn whoever came next. On the spine, in faded ink, the file carries a bland label, Wormwood-2, Environmental Anomaly Post-Test, Zone R3. No emblem, no slogan, no heroic project name, just that biblical code name and a number, as if this were a sequel nobody wanted to talk about. The reading room where I opened it was the same as always. Low ceiling, fluorescent light buzzing at a pitch just high enough to irritate. Stale air that smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. Outside the windows, mid-afternoon city noise drifted in. A bus braking, a distant siren, somebody laughing too loudly on the street below. Inside, the world shrank to a rectangle of cardboard, thin paper, and whatever the past had decided to preserve. The official summary at the front of the folder is short and evasive. Translated, it reads, Anomaly Wormwood-2 refers to unusual environmental readings observed in the aftermath of a controlled release at Test Area R3. Data inconsistencies suggest transient interference in instrumentation and dispersal modeling. Operational impact minimal. Further investigation deemed non-essential. Non-essential is another of those polite words that mean we didn't like what we saw, and we're hoping it goes away if we push it into a smaller box. The origin of the anomaly is buried in a more conventional story. Zone R3 was a remote test area in the interior, far from major population centers, close to a river that never makes it onto tourist maps. Its official function, according to the few surviving planning documents, was combined radiological and atmospheric testing. In simpler terms, small-scale releases meant to study how contaminants spread under different conditions. Wind patterns, humidity, terrain. It was the sort of place built by a state that expected to live alongside fallout indefinitely, and wanted to feel like it understood its moods. The complex itself was limited. A central lab building with reinforced walls and a flat roof. A small cluster of concrete bunkers. A tall metal mast bristling with meteorological instruments, and a grid of monitoring posts scattered across the scrubland and hills. Most of the time, only a skeleton crew lived on site. Technicians, a few scientists rotating in and out, and the inevitable security presence. A larger team arrived whenever a test was scheduled. The file does not name the first wormwood. You can feel it there in the silence, though. Chernobyl means wormwood in one Slavic tongue, and someone, somewhere, decided that whatever happened at R3 15 years later deserved to be filed under the same bitter plant, even if on a different scale. Wormwood-2, the second taste, the release, the file's word, never once calling it an accident, was recorded on a dry, windless day in early autumn. A reactor mock-up in one of the bunkers was flushed, and a controlled plume of radioactive gas was vented through a tall stack, under conditions carefully chosen to make modeling easy. Low turbulence, stable air, no clouds to complicate the picture. They had laid out their instruments in a neat web. Fixed posts with Geiger counters, gamma spectrometers, air samplers mounted on low poles and tripods, all wired back to the central lab through underground cables. Portable devices carried by field teams. Even a few sealed film badges pinned to stakes to be collected later and developed for a slower, more old-fashioned dose picture. The first hour went by the book. The plume rose, spread, and the nearest monitors climbed as expected. Counts per second sweeping upwards in that soft, unpleasant way that means some part of the world has become more dangerous. The more distant stations responded in sequence, a ripple of increased readings moving outward as the invisible cloud drifted with the thin breeze. If the incident had stopped there, Wormwood-2 would never have been given a code name. The charts would have been filed, the models updated, the residual contamination fenced, and the place left to the birds. But somewhere between the third and fourth hour, as the plume thinned and the numbers should have been settling into a predictable decay, the pattern went wrong. The logs preserve it in a strangely hesitant way, as if the people recording it were editing themselves even while writing. One technician reports that, on a monitor linked to a station 2 kilometers north of the stack, the count rate dropped sharply, not towards background, but into a narrow valley below the level it had been before the test. For several minutes, the graph hugged that lower line, as if some invisible eraser had passed over the area and wiped out natural radiation along with the new contamination. The first assumption, naturally, was instrument failure. Cable fault, tube burnout, bad connections. Another technician was already on the way to that station, so they radioed him. Check the hardware. He reached the post, took the cover off the metal box, and ran his portable device alongside the fixed detector. His handheld meter showed a slight rise above background. Nothing unusual this close to the site after a release. The fixed detector, wired to the lab, reported near zero. He tapped it. Nothing changed. He swapped the tube with a spare. The numbers stayed low. From the lab's vantage point, it still looked like the instrument stood in a small, precise pocket of missing radiation. The anomaly moved before they had time to agree on a diagnosis. Within minutes, another station to the east showed the same behavior. A sudden dip below baseline, a flat line of suppressed counts, then a gradual climb back up to something closer to normal. The timing did not match wind direction. The stations affected were not downwind neighbors. They flickered, one after another, like lights going dim in a pattern that made more sense on the map than in the air. None of this is how fallout acts. Radioactive material deposited from a cloud does not carve out pits of absence. It sprinkles extra risk wherever it falls, raising numbers, not lowering them. Background radiation is the hum of cosmos and Earth. You do not turn it off like a lamp in one meadow and on in another. When more than 3 stations showed the same dip, the staff in the lab stopped using the word fault and started using interference. They checked power, stable, They checked the trunk cables, no breaks, no shorts. They cross-tested detectors. A unit that read normal in one location would fall into the shadow if moved into an affected area, and return to its proper behavior if carried back out. A shadow, then. That is what several of the handwritten notes call it. Shadow zones. Places where the counters behaved as if the very idea of radiation had been dialed down. One of the older physicists on the team wrote, without irony, local reduction of effective field, and underlined it twice. The question mark stayed. Not all anomalies were negative. Along the southern edge of the grid, one station that had recorded a modest rise after the release suddenly jumped, hours later, to levels that should only have been possible much closer to the source in the first minutes. For 10 minutes, the slender trace on the graph went from a reasonable bump to a thick band of frantic scribbles, then dropped back to something boring. On the ground, the field technician stationed there saw nothing. No change in wind, no visible dust, no smell. His portable meter, held at arm's length in front of his face, wobbled mildly, never matching the numbers pouring into the lab from his own fixed detector a few meters away. Band of intense flux at station S14, the official log says. No corresponding environmental feature observed. Behind those words, you can feel the eyes on the KGB liaison, already present in the control room. He had not come for the science. He had come because anything involving radiation and remote test sites made the committee nervous. His handwritten note in the margin is brief. Verify against alternate instruments. Rule out data contamination. Data contamination. In a way, that phrase turns out to be more accurate than he meant it to be. By evening, they had a map that looked less like a fallout pattern and more like someone had taken a pair of scissors to the expected plume and rearranged pieces without caring about wind or gravity. Pockets of reduced radiation, pockets of heightened counts, drifting through the grid in ways that refused to settle into any known dispersal model. The models, of course, were not prepared to admit this. On paper, in the simple equations that run civil defense plans and hazard maps, contamination follows certain gradients. You can tilt them by messing with the weather, but the core behavior is fixed, up, out, down, thin. What the technicians were staring at on their boards that night was something else. Readings that suggested a pattern moving through their network that cared more about the layout of instruments than about soil, air, or distance from the stack. One of them, a younger engineer whose name appears only 3 times in the file, wrote a line in his notes that no one would have let into the official report. It behaves as if it sees detectors as places and ground as an afterthought. He underlined that too, then, perhaps wisely, did not repeat the thought anywhere the KGB could easily quote it back at him. They did the obvious checks, swapped cables between stations, cross-connected instruments so that one detector fed multiple channels and one channel received alternating detectors. The anomalies followed neither the tubes nor the wires reliably. Sometimes a shadow zone would stick to a location. Sometimes it would seem to ride a line on the map, showing up wherever the network had the greatest density of sensors. Even the air samplers, slow but stubborn, joined in the confusion. Filters pulled from stations with normal counts showed higher contamination when analyzed later in distant labs. Filters from hot stations sometimes showed less. It was as if whatever they were trying to catch had decided, out of sheer spite, that being measured was a variable, not a constant. The file calls the night after the test the drifting phase. The technicians worked shifts, eyes red, fingers stained with ink as they swapped out paper rolls and tried to keep up. The KGB observers stayed. They did not ask many questions. They mainly watched. Around midnight, the lab's environmental instruments began to misbehave as well. These were not radiation detectors, but devices for temperature, humidity, air pressure. For hours, they had done what they always did: obediently tracked the state of the air in and around the building. Then, without any external weather change, several of them began logging small oscillations that looked uncomfortably like the fading echoes you see after a seismic event. The ground did not tremble. Beakers on shelves did not rattle. People did not feel a tremor. Only the sensors, wired into the same monitoring array used for the fallout, recorded a soft, slow wave passing through their values. "Spurious modulation," one of the staff wrote, trying to keep the language neutral. Another added, in smaller script, patterns similar to moving shadow zones. That was when somebody in the room finally made the connection in words. Whatever was drifting across their map was no longer just fallout. At least, not in the way they were paid to understand it. It was acting like a field that cared about being seen. The KGB liaison's reaction is preserved in a single, half-ripped page. In translation, his comment reads, "Recommendation: restrict discussion of intelligent pattern. Maintain framework of instrumentation fault until higher analysis completed. Note that speculation about non-local behavior may have undesirable interpretive consequences among staff." Non-local behavior. Another polite phrase for "does not stay where we put it." By morning, the anomaly had not stopped, but it had changed character. The wild spikes and pits gave way to subtler trickles, like residue diffusing through cloth. The stations that had been most erratic settled into low, uneven hums. The map, which for a while had looked like a storm passing through their grid, now resembled something slower, a stain soaking into fibers. The immediate emergency phase ended. No one died. No alarms were raised beyond the site. The distant labs that eventually processed the filters and badges did not stage any interventions. The doses, even where strange, were mostly small. Operational impact, as the summary says, was indeed minimal. It would have ended there. An unpleasant, confusing episode filed under bad equipment and forgotten, if not for two things: the internal experiments that followed and the way the anomaly failed to stay tied to the test site. The lab's lead physicist, a man whose handwriting becomes more tense as the file goes on, proposed what he called controlled probes. If there was an interference field, or whatever you wanted to call it, moving through their network, then perhaps they could evoke it on a smaller scale, in a controlled environment. Not out in the grid, where weather and wind muddied everything, but inside their own walls. He had access to sealed sources, small, well-characterized samples of radioactive material used to calibrate instruments. Their behavior was predictable, even comforting. At a given distance, behind a given shield, they produced known count rates. If something was truly wrong with the environment, it should show up as deviations when these simple setups were repeated over time. They cleared a room in the basement, away from foot traffic, and placed a detector and a sealed source in fixed positions on a table. Every hour on the hour, a technician would enter, record the count rate for a few minutes, and leave. No rotation, no moving parts. For the first day, the numbers barely wobbled. For the second, they drifted within acceptable tolerances. On the third, the room became part of Wormwood-2. The log for OR-49 records a dip lower count rate than expected by several standard deviations. Hour 50, normal again. Hour 51, a rise above baseline, matched by no known change in the source. They checked temperature. Stable. They checked for electronic interference. None. They replaced the tube. The pattern persisted. A slow, rolling undulation in count rate over hours, unaffected by the small physical system in front of them. What changed, as one technician eventually noted in an aside, was not the source but the broader environment. On a day when the outdoor grid showed a resurgence in shadow zones north of the lab, the basement setup recorded suppressed counts. When a hot band passed through stations to the south, the basement readings climbed slightly above expectation, as if that small room had become one more node in a larger field. It was as if the basement had been added to a list. The KGB liaison did not like the basement experiment. His notes grow sharper. "Cease speculative framing," he writes beside a description of the rolling fluctuations. "Treat as calibration drift, unless repeatable correlation with specific operational parameters is proven." The physicist, more stubborn than prudent, continues for another week. He plots the basement deviations against the wider grid anomalies on transparent sheets, overlays them, and circles several points where peaks and dips match. His comment in the margin is simple: "This is not noise." At some point, someone above his pay grade reads that and decides the wrong kind of mind has been applied to the problem. The basement experiment is ordered to stop. The sealed sources are locked back into their cabinets. The transparent overlays vanish from the file, leaving only impressions in the paper where they once pressed lines into the page. But the strong-willed phenomenon does not stop just because someone marks a project terminated. Weeks later, another site, hundreds of kilometers away, begins to log small irregularities in its own routine measurements. This second site is not a test range, but a medical isotope production facility, an industrial plant that produces radioisotopes for hospitals, research centers, and occasionally less public customers. Its generators, shields, and monitors are designed for continuous operation. If anything deviates, alarms ring. The place is too critical and too potentially dangerous to tolerate sloppy numbers. For 3 days, their waste stack monitors record slight dips in background count rate during certain hours, unrelated to any known shutdown or weather pattern. The staff assume minor calibration issues and schedule maintenance. While they are inspecting cables, one of the technicians notices a note pinned to the bulletin board by the entrance. A circular from the Central Environmental Monitoring Directorate, reminding all facilities to report unusual patterns in low-level radiation fields in the wake of recent test anomalies. He recognizes the reference code in the corner. It matches the one used for Wormwood-2. Later, pieces of this plant's log are inserted into the Wormwood file. The connection is never spelled out. No one writes the bold sentence that would tie the two events together, but the implication is there. Whatever passed through R3's grid during that test did not stay confined to that valley. It's tempting at this point to reach for dramatic language. The fallout learned to use wires, or something equally eager. The file resists that impulse, barely. Instead, it accumulates evidence of a quieter kind, coincidence upon coincidence, misbehavior that tracks bureaucratic relationships better than wind directions. Facilities wired into the same regional monitoring system as R3, sharing data lines, calibration routines, staff rotations, show minor, transient anomalies in their background readings over the months following Wormwood-2. Not catastrophic, not even dangerous, just off. Geologically distant sites with no such connection do not report similar issues in the same interval. One statistician, tasked with comparing incident reports, notes the correlation and writes a careful phrase. Distribution of anomalies shows closer dependence on system architecture than on geographic proximity. In other words, the fallout followed the network. This is the point in the file where the KGB presence thickens and the language thins. You can feel the bureaucratic temperature drop. Pages are more heavily redacted. Handwritten notes are rarer and shorter. Official summaries lean harder on phrases like likely calibration drift, psychological factors, data artifacts. Behind that, however, the behavior of individual instruments continues to betray a more unsettling story. The monitoring boards in the Central Directorate, large panels that display rolled-up data from dozens of sites, begin to show occasional ghost traces. Lines that flicker into existence for a few seconds, unconnected to any labeled channel, then vanish. No corresponding signals exist on the raw feeds. Only on the aggregated displays, where multiple inputs are layered and interpreted by the same electronics, do these phantom movements appear. A board operator, used to staring at these boards for long shifts, sketches one of the ghost traces in his notebook. He draws a second one the following week, when a similar flicker occurs. When he finally compares them, he realizes they are almost identical, down to the odd kink in what should be a smooth decay. He quietly labels them Wormwood Tail 1 and Wormwood Tail 2. When he mentions this to a colleague, the colleague shrugs it off. All systems have quirks, he says. As long as the alarms ring when they should, who cares what ghosts the boards show? It's a reasonable attitude in a building full of old equipment and older habits, but it leaves a trace in this file, because the operator in question is later reassigned to R3 for a review visit, and his notes travel with him. It is during that visit that the strange shift in the data field occurs. By then, the initial chaos has cooled. The test area has been partly decontaminated, partly fenced off, partly left to the scrub and wind. The grid remains, albeit in a simplified form. A handful of key stations still wired back to the lab, the rest mothballed. The facility runs more drills than real releases. Wormwood-2 is already half a ghost in its own home. The visiting operator stands in the central monitoring room of R3, in front of a smaller, older version of the boards he used in the city. The air smells of stale filters and metal. Out beyond the windows, the low hills lie in a bleached row, indifferent. On the schedule for that day is a straightforward test. Simulate a distant release by injecting a small, controlled signal into one of the stations, then watch how it propagates through the analysis chain. No actual contamination involved, just numbers. They begin. A technician keys the injection. The chosen station's channel shows the expected bump. The processing software, primitive by modern standards but serviceable, filters and smooths the data. On the main display, a harmless, shallow plume symbol appears on the map overlay, spreading out along predictable lines. Then, as they're watching, the bump slips. It moves not from the injected station outward, but sideways into another channel, then another, not along the model's wind vectors, but along the routes of the underlying data cables. For a few seconds, the map shows a plume marching right through terrain with no physical meaning. Across rock ridges it should not cross. Around buildings it should ignore, sticking instead to the infrastructure that connects instruments. On the raw channel readouts, nothing has changed. The injected station shows the expected signal. The others remain flat. Only on the combined display has the plume decided to travel along the network's skeleton. This is the shift the official description alludes to. A strange shift moved through the data field. They saw, in real time, a processed image behave as if it were tracking not the air, but its own wiring. The KGB overseer present for this simulation does not interrupt. He does not shout or demand shutdown. He watches until the anomaly completes its brief march and settles, then calmly tells the staff to repeat the test with independent hardware. They do. On a backup system, less entangled with the central processing chain, the injected signal behaves itself. It rises, falls, spreads properly, obeys the model. On the main system, even after a refresh, small hints of the earlier misbehavior remain. Tiny, unnecessary kinks in otherwise smooth curves, as if some residual habit of movement has been learned and cannot quite be forgotten. The official log writes this off as a software glitch. Processing artifact, corrected in subsequent recalibration. The code is scrubbed. The configuration files are rewritten. The ghost plume, for all practical purposes, is exercised. But the operator, the same one who drew the ghost traces in his notebook, adds a private line beneath his neat sketch of the misbehaving map. Same curve as tails 1 and 2, but laid over geography differently. It is the shape that persists, not the medium. That sentence never appears in any formal document. It survives because he copied it onto a scrap of paper, folded it into the Wormwood-2 folder when nobody was watching, and hoped someone like me would find it. Whatever moved through those systems after the test, call it a pattern, call it a ghost, call it an emergent resonance of data and contamination, had acquired a preferred way of decaying. That shape kept turning up, whether in raw readings, ghost traces, or misroted plumes. It did not behave like particles drifting downwind. It behaved like something tracing and retracing a path carved into the combined hardware and software of the entire monitoring network. The cover-up, when it comes, is not dramatic. No burning of documents, no vanished scientists. It is bureaucratic and methodical. A directive arrives from the Central Committee responsible for environmental monitoring, instructing all regional stations to standardize calibration procedures and harmonize noise filtering parameters in light of recent modeling inconsistencies. Attached is a new set of software patches and configuration guidelines. The language is dry. There is no mention of Wormwood-2, no mention of anomalies or shadows. But the effect is clear. Every system that might be showing the persistent shape is told to smooth, subtract, average, and discard anything that does not match the expected decay curves. In other words, teach the instruments to stop telling you what they are actually experiencing. In the months after this harmonization, reports of anomalies drop sharply. The few that do make it through are dismissed more aggressively. Operator error. Legacy hardware. Transcription mistake. The valley at R3 continues to exist. Its soil holds whatever contaminants the release left behind. Grass grows, birds return. The monitoring grid is gradually dismantled. The poles and boxes taken down, labels peeled off, cables left under the ground like roots of a cut tree. People pass through the area years later, and if they know anything at all about its past, refer to it as some old test site. They feel nothing odd. The air does what air does. The river runs the way rivers always do, toward some larger body that does not care about forgotten codename folders. On paper, Wormwood-2 is closed. The last official sheet in the file reads, "Incident analyzed. Instrumentation updated. No ongoing operational risk. Case archived for historical study." That's the kind of neat line that lets an institution sleep. But the file I have in front of me is not that neat. It contains those extra pages, those scraps of notebooks, those marginal scribbles that didn't get fully erased. They tell a more persistent story. Something about a release that taught a system a new way to twitch, and a system that never entirely unlearned the motion. I wish I could say there is a clear moral, that the anomaly was either conquered or escaped, that it either mutated into some identifiable threat or faded into nothing. The truth this file offers is smaller and, in its own way, more disturbing. After Wormwood-2, for years, there were people in that directorate who did not entirely trust the quiet on their boards. An operator who had been on shift during the main anomaly later told an interviewer, off the record, his words paraphrased, his name stripped, that he developed a habit of glancing at the edges of the displays, not the active channels. "The real trouble," he said, "never starts where you expect. It starts where the system thinks nothing should be." A field technician, now retired, reported that in the winters following the incident, his portable meters would occasionally flicker in empty warehouses or along cable runs far from any known source, logging tiny, coherent pulses unrelated to any measurable contamination. "It felt," he said, "like walking through the echo of a siren that had been switched off years before." A physician assigned briefly to YAR-3 during its decommissioning phase wrote in his diary, not in any official report, that the staff there complained of strange dreams. Not nightmares about reactors or explosions. Just recurring images of maps and grids, lines lighting up and going dark. Numbers pulsing in sequences that left them waking with the sense that they had just failed an exam in a subject that didn't exist. He didn't share those notes with his superiors. He'd seen what happened to colleagues who brought the wrong kind of detail to the wrong kind of desk. He folded the diary away instead. Years later, some part of it ended up scanned and cross-referenced with this folder, because whoever assembled the archive realized the word wormwood appears in his private index. That's how these stories hang together here. Not through a clean backbone of narrative, but through small connective tissues of fear and pattern. A phrase in a margin, a sketch, a half-erased warning inside a cover. "Contamination does not stay where matter is," that first pencil line said. "Do not trust distance." The official doctrine of that time, and, if we're honest, of this one, depends on exactly the opposite belief. That once something dangerous is diluted enough, far enough away, we can declare it under control. A field loses strength with distance. Fallout thins, disperses, and becomes background. A system, once scrubbed and recalibrated, returns to innocence. Wormwood-2 offers a quieter possibility. That once you've taught a network to carry a particular kind of disturbance, the pattern can outlive the particles. That the idea of a plume can move through cables, boards, and habits long after the air has returned to its usual invisible soup. A state built on charts and thresholds doesn't have much room for that. It needs its lines to stay where they are, its safe distances to remain safe. So it does what it always does when confronted with something that undermines its own counting. It reframes, smooths, and files. The unresolved question, the one nobody dared to write but that sits under all of this like a hidden layer, is simple. If fallout can, once, behave more like information than like dust, how sure are we that our own methods of tracking danger aren't teaching reality new ways to move? No one in the Wormwood-2 file answers that. They weren't allowed to. Their job was to measure, report, and then adjust their instruments until the measurements matched the report. Mine, now, is just to open the folder, feel the slight sting behind my eyes when I read that pencil note again, and remember that not all contamination glows on Geiger tubes. Some of it lives in systems, procedures, and assumptions. Some of it lives in the quiet faith that distance alone is safety. That faith is the real fallout here. It spread far beyond Zone R3, settled into policy, training, textbooks. It still sits, invisible, in the way we talk about thresholds and acceptable risk. Every so often, in some modern control room somewhere, a board will twitch. One ghost trace, one meaningless kink in a smooth curve, one brief dip below baseline no one can explain. Someone will shrug, log it as noise, and move on. Maybe that's all it is. Noise. Or maybe, every now and then, something that passed through another set of boards decades ago is still, faintly, replaying itself. Not as a threat, not as a lesson, just as a reminder that once, in one valley, fallout did not act like fallout, and was quietly told never to do it again.